Hello, this is Dr. Grande. Today's question is, can I analyze the case of Scott Harrell and the Buc-ee's traffic stop? Just a reminder, I'm not diagnosing by this video, only speculating about what could be happening in a situation like this. If you enjoy this video, please like it, subscribe to my channel, and consider supporting me on Patreon. I will put the link to Patreon in the description for this video. First, I'll look at the background of this case, move to the timeline of the incident, then offer my analysis. This case takes place in 2023 at the Buc-ee's convenience store / gas station in Texas City, Texas. Buc-ee's is a popular business that operates locations in Texas and several other southern states. They claim to have the cleanest restrooms in America. They also claim to hold the record for the largest convenience store at over 66,000 square feet and the longest car wash at 255 feet. I wonder if consumers really contemplate the length of a car wash when deciding where to take their car. It's hard to imagine the owner of a dirty vehicle on the phone with Buc-ee's saying, "I don't care about the price. Tell me how long the car wash is." Now moving to the timeline of the incident. On April 19, 2023, a man named Christopher Shaw pulled into Buc-ee's to refuel his Hyundai Elantra. As he was making his way to the pump, he allegedly cut across parking spaces on the Buc-ee's property. A police officer named Scott Harrell pulled up behind Christopher's vehicle. Scott worked for the Texas City Police Department since November 2018. Here is a summary of the encounter between Scott and Christopher. Some of this is paraphrased. Scott exited his police cruiser and said, "Hey man, you can't drive through the parking lot like this." Scott asked for Christopher's driver's license and insurance and accused Christopher of speeding and cutting through parking spaces. Christopher made it clear that he did not think that he did anything wrong. Scott responded by saying, "Are we going to go back and forth on this?" Christopher explained how he visited Buc-ee's every day, and there's rarely cars parked in the parking spaces where he cut through. He told Scott that he believed he was going slower than usual, but understood that Scott believed that he was driving fast. Scott went to the police cruiser for a moment and then resumed the conversation with Christopher. He explained that he was out of tickets, and that's the only reason he would not be writing him a ticket. Christopher asked what offense the ticket would have been written for. Scott said, "Disregarding a traffic control device." Christopher mentioned how they were on private property. Scott said that he didn't appreciate Christopher's attitude, and then Scott made another bizarre statement. He said, quote, "You know you did wrong, you know you're not supposed to cut through the parking lot, and instead of being like, 'Oh, yeah, I messed up, I'm sorry, it won't happen again,' you want to sit there and go back and forth," unquote. Christopher implied that the officer could be more productive by pursuing more serious offenses. Scott responded, "Do you want to go to jail? You could go to jail for this." Christopher told the officer he could do whatever he wanted to do. Scott explained how taking him to jail would be a waste of his time, and he did not want to do that. But then he complained about Christopher's behavior, saying the attitude wasn't really necessary. Scott continued by saying that he had not been rude, suggesting it would not be possible to be rude because he was wearing a camera. He then introduced the idea of Christopher filing a complaint against him, and seemed to be concerned that Christopher would do that. Christopher explained to the officer that they were good. As the men were ready to part ways and Scott was turning toward his police cruiser, Christopher mentioned how he would be looking up the law about driving on private property. He did not believe that Scott had the authority to enforce traffic laws on private property. This appears to have been a turning point during the encounter. Scott told Christopher that he could take him to jail for Class B reckless driving, only to correct himself and say Class A reckless driving. In Texas, reckless driving is operating a motor vehicle with willful or wanton disregard for the safety of others or personal property. In order to be charged as a Class A misdemeanor, the individual must recklessly engage in behavior that places another person in danger of serious bodily injury. Scott was invoking a charge that was far more serious than his original accusation. Scott continued by claiming that Christopher almost hit another vehicle. Christopher explained to Scott that he did not almost hit another vehicle, and there were cameras everywhere, implying that the video surveillance would vindicate him. Christopher explained how he was trying to be reasonable with the officer, but then Scott claimed that Christopher was becoming upset. Christopher explained that he thought the whole situation was ridiculous. This is why he was upset. He pointed out that Scott was threatening to take him to jail. He suggested that Scott threatening to arrest him over something that was not true represented a Class A misdemeanor, meaning Scott was committing a crime. Christopher once again said to Scott that they were good, but Scott said, "I don't feel like we are. I think that this is a problem." Scott claimed that he felt as though Christopher would continue engaging in unsafe behaviors. Christopher responded, quote, "Now we're playing Jean-Claude Van Damme future cop, and you need to stop me from something I may do in the future?" Unquote. This appears to be a reference to the 1994 movie Time Cop, which featured Jean-Claude Van Damme as Max Walker of the Time Enforcement Commission. This is a good movie, but it has more plot holes than Officer Scott Harrell's traffic stop. It's worth mentioning that Time Cop was the wrong movie to reference. The behavior Scott was demonstrating was more consistent with the 2002 movie Minority Report. Time Cop was a movie about preventing individuals from altering the past to change the future. Minority Report was about arresting people before they committed crimes. Moving back to the encounter, Scott may not have been a fan of Time Cop, considering his next move. He handcuffed Christopher and placed him in the back of the police cruiser. The two then debated about whether Christopher came close to hitting another vehicle when he was driving across the Buc-ee's parking lot. Scott accused him of this, but Christopher denied it. Christopher asked if they could cool off the situation, but Scott replied, quote, "You've forced my hand because if I don't go and see this through to its conclusion, I know you're going to go to the police department and file a complaint on me. Now, the complaint is not going to do anything because I have it all on video." Unquote. Christopher explained that he did not think he did anything wrong. Scott was clearly upset with Christopher for disagreeing with him. Another officer showed up at the scene. This officer had a ticket book. Therefore, Scott decided to give Christopher a citation instead of taking him to jail. He told Christopher, "I think going to jail is a bit excessive." He removed the handcuffs and gave Christopher a ticket. They parted ways without any further difficulties. In reference to the encounter, the chief of the Texas City Police Department issued a statement on May 24, 2023. The statement indicated the department had policies prohibiting officers from violating the rights of individuals. Officers who violate these policies can be fired. The chief reviewed the conduct of Officer Scott Harrell and ordered the incident to be investigated by the Office of Professional Standards. Internal Affairs is now involved and criminal charges are possible. On May 26, Christopher received a letter in the mail stating the citation for disregarding a traffic control device was dismissed. Now moving to my analysis. Here are my thoughts on a few areas that stood out to me in this case. Item number 1. The police have a limited ability to enforce traffic laws on private property, but they are not powerless. If Christopher was driving too fast for the conditions and endangering the public, Scott did have a duty to intervene. I'm not sure what ticket he could have written, but this idea that people can drive any way they want in a parking lot without consequences is not realistic. Item number 2. Christopher's best strategy after being approached by Scott was to remain silent. He, of course, had a right to protest and a right to disagree. Christopher was not angry, belligerent, disrespectful, or anything even close to these behaviors. He simply wanted his opinion to be heard by the officer. The problem here was that Scott Harrell wasn't going to listen to anything that Christopher had to say. There was no reasoning with this officer. Item number 3. What do I think happened in this situation? This is just a theory, my opinion. It appears as though Scott lost control of his temper and initiated this traffic stop, like he was personally upset that Christopher allegedly drove unsafely. There's this sense that Scott really didn't have a plan. He didn't know what kind of ticket he could write. I think he just expected Christopher to apologize and that would be the end of the encounter. At some point, Scott realized that he was in the wrong. Christopher had not actually driven unsafely, or Scott was not able to write a ticket for whatever he thought Christopher did. Scott felt as though Christopher was going to complain to the Texas City Police Department about his behavior. This was an important moment during the encounter. Scott should have walked away and just accepted that Christopher might complain, but instead he decided he did not want to sustain any consequences for his behavior. Scott wanted to leave the encounter with Christopher feeling as though Scott did him a favor. This is what Scott thought would prevent a complaint. When he realized Christopher wasn't going to back down, Scott attempted to dominate the situation. He wanted to force Christopher to agree with him, falsely believing that this would invalidate any future complaint. At this point, Scott's options were becoming limited. He was digging himself into a hole, but he still could have walked away. Instead, he chose to escalate the situation. Scott introduced a brand new reckless driving accusation and threatened Christopher, but Christopher remained steadfast and refused to admit any wrongdoing. Now Scott was in an even worse position. Instead of accepting defeat, he once again decided to escalate. Scott handcuffed Christopher in order to force him to admit fault. Eventually, Scott accepted that he had lost and decided to release Christopher. Scott acted as though the other officer having a ticket book allowed him to act on feelings of mercy, telling Christopher that jail was excessive. Again, Scott was trying to end the confrontation on his terms, with Christopher having a reason to be grateful about Scott's charitable behavior. Moving to item number 4, Scott's desire to dominate the situation prevented him from evaluating other options. He never considered that he could be wrong or that Christopher might stand up for himself. Police officers are trained to control dangerous situations, but sometimes they take this too far and it becomes a general attitude. Every encounter becomes one that must be dominated. Scott could have easily extricated himself from the situation without jeopardizing his job by applying critical thinking and listening skills. Scott's lack of insight made it impossible for him to see past his own grandiosity and sense of entitlement. His hypersensitivity to criticism was so pronounced that he became anxious about a possible complaint. Moving to the last item, number 5, who do I think was right or wrong in this situation? I think that both men could have adopted more effective strategies, but overall, the blame for this disastrous traffic stop mostly rests on Scott Harrell. His own fragile sense of self trapped him on a hazardous path that was destined to jeopardize his law enforcement career. His behavior undermines confidence in law enforcement and makes people feel unsafe. Not even a facility with the cleanest bathrooms in America can protect citizens from the dirty tactics of law enforcement. Those are my thoughts on the Scott Harrell traffic stop at Buc-ee's in Texas City, Texas. Please put any opinions and thoughts in the comments section. They always generate an interesting dialogue. As always, I hope you found my analysis of this topic to be informative. Thanks for watching.